and so I'd like to introduce the talk. So Adam Lenton is a new voice on Eurasia, and he's part of our series, which is an event series designed to introduce young and up-and-coming experts on Eurasia from around Europe, Eurasia, and North America. So I used to be young myself, and then I noticed everyone's looking young, the students, and now most of the professors are younger than I am too. So, but it's good to have a new voice, and this is part of the PONARD Eurasia Network, which is a network of over 125 scholars dedicated to advancing new approaches to research on security, politics, economics, and society in Russian Eurasia. And of course, this is part of the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies in the Elliott School of International Affairs here at George Washington University. And the only thing you need to know about Adam is that he graduated from here with a PhD in 2023. And now he's a professor at Wake Forest. So Adam, the floor is yours. Why don't you speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and discussion.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Bob, for the warm introduction, especially the compliment that I'm young. Getting to the age now, where that's a compliment. So thank you very much, and to everybody, Marlene, David, and Kelly for organisation, and also Bob for moderating. So yeah, it's a particularly honour to be back here, where I've spent so many hours as a graduate student, benefited from a lot of PONARD events that have been held over the many years. So my talk today, I want to bridge a few research projects, both past and present, talk a little bit about recent developments, and sort of thinking through debates over collapse. But I'll most talk about my ongoing book project, which looks at Imperial pre-Soviet legacies of ethnic mobilization in Russia. I'll share some research from this, it's ongoing, but then I'd like to spend a few minutes at the end fleshing out a few policy implications that I believe flow from these sets of projects. So, as we enter the fourth year of the Russia-Ukraine war, Russia's future development remains a topic whose importance and interest are only surpassed by the profound uncertainty of any sort of forecasting. Most analysts do consider any possible collapse or disintegration of the Russian Federation highly unlikely, but whether it's dismissing it, deriding it, or even depicting this as desirable, it's a regular refrain in more comprehensive discussions of possible future paths. Now, setting aside issues of likelihood and desirability, which I'm not well qualified to predict, the spectre of collapse, I'd like to suggest, does have considerable political traction. On the one hand, you can point to, on one extreme, point to platforms like the Forum of Free Nations of Post-Russia. It's a collection of several dozen groups and associations that represent 41 supposed new states that would allegedly succeed Russia. You can see that the territories neatly carved out, replete with flags. Now the map, if you look into the details, there's a few questions. So, South Sakhalin ends up sort of being part of Japan. The land border with North Korea ends up being given to China, and Chechnya ends up swallowing half of Dagestan, while the Nogai Republic's capital is not in the Nogai Republic here. But while the forum raises several questions, both regarding the legitimacy of its participants and the territorial tensions, as I mentioned before, collapse does have potency as an ideological signifier, right? And I think we can see this in Russian opposition writ large, right? There's a tension between those whose emphasis is on reforming the regime, an overthrow of Putin, maybe some democratic reforms on the one hand, and those whose emphasis is on a broader reformation of the state. Not just collapse, but rethinking the role of empire, for example, rethinking the relationship of Moscow and the regions. And we can see this quite well in Yulia Navalnaya's recent speech in Slovenia last September. I don't know if the sound will play.
There are those who advocate for the urgent decolonization of Russia, arguing to split our vast country into several small safe states. However, these colonizers can't explain why people with a shared background and culture should be artificially divided, nor do they say how this process should even take place. We see a wide range of opinions, but we don't see a strategy. Of course, it's very difficult to reach compromise from such diverse positions, but reaching a compromise is the job of politicians.
So, this speech was widely criticised by decolonial groups and activists. So, It didn't help that when it was translated into Russian, there are those was translated as найдем и тех, or we will find those. Didn't help with the sort of misunderstanding. But it was criticized for two reasons. One is equating decolonization with kind of this crude understanding of collapse, but at the same time, I think reinforcing a long-standing frustration on the part of decolonial activists that the Russian liberal opposition was generally uninterested in reaching common ground and sort of really listening to these voices. The Asians of Russia group that sort of posted this on Instagram, they said, they lamented, are we not also your potential electorate? Now, this is a signifier, it's both used to synthesize and to separate, right? So on the one hand, by equating decolonization with separatism, it provides a useful foil to contrast the opposition's more moderate and prescribed aims. But there's also a way in which decolonization is used to separate, right? So in this clip we see Mikhail Godorkovsky speaking in Warsaw in September.
For some reason,
October,
I've decided that there's the collapse of the Putin regime is tantamount to the collapse of the Russian Federation. And they're really afraid of the collapse of the Russian Federation. They're saying, let's not do anything that would collapse the Putin regime, and it would collapse Russia. But it's not an equal sign between the two. Please tell your American friends, because they don't listen to me.
It's not just among the opposition, though, that we see this debate taking place. There's a broader story about the Kremlin's anxieties over collapse, whether we look at the experience of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the formative experience for many of the upper echelons of the current ruling elite. But I just wanted to illustrate a few examples from the past year that illustrate how this has become quite a potent frame in official discourse. So, claiming that Western policy seeks to provide ideological legitimation for dismemberment of our fatherland, again equating this with decolonization. This was Putin's last address to the Federal Assembly. We see continuation of this theme when he talks to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs last June, where he talks about the aim being to seek discord by splitting Russia from within, which he says, of course, didn't happen because of the united, resolute determination of the multinational people. And recently, Sergei Lavrov, in his annual speech to MGIMO students, similarly, actually explicitly said that a coalition of 50 nations has gathered with the goal of dismembering Russia, and this is actually a part of a consistent Western policy. Now, this isn't just in rhetoric. Just a couple of weeks ago, a list of about 172 organizations supposedly affiliated with the Forum of Free Nations was actually added to the FSB's terrorist organizations list following a court order in November. So this is something that the government takes seriously and backs up, not through words but also actions. Collapse also has a transnational aspect. If we look at Ukraine, for example, many in the senior leadership make predictions and sort of claims about the direction that Russia is heading and signal that collapse is a possibility. Now, President Zelensky has been quite muted in his discussions of this. He, for example, made the claim that Putin is kind of repeating what Russia did in 1917. He's also sort of wore this T-shirt back in October that "Make Russia Small Again." But I won't go through the various quotes, but you can see that this is a refrain that we see among Ukrainian decision makers, from the National Security Council and elsewhere. Again, it's not just about rhetoric. There's been a flurry of legislative acts as well, ranging from 2022, when Chechen Republic of Ichkeria was claimed to be temporarily occupied by Russia, to just a couple of weeks ago, Ukraine's parliament recognized the Circassian genocide. It's important for a couple of reasons. One, this is actually related to a period of pre-Soviet Russian imperial expansion. This was in the 19th century. But also that Ukraine now is only the second country after Georgia to recognize this as a genocide. Now, these policies are relatively symbolic, we might say, but there's also a kinetic aspect to discussions of collapse as well. Whether we look at the incursion into Kursk Oblast, which, if we're thinking about the Bavarian understanding of sovereignty, Russia no longer fully controls all of its territory, to the broader arc of this war, where you see, for example, Russia annexing territories it doesn't fully control, to the much discussed but very brief mutiny of Yevgeny Prigozhin for a few days back in 2023, where he controlled part of Rostov and its environs. How can we make sense of this all? This is where my argument about imperial legacies comes in. So I'd like to suggest that there's two productive ways we might cut through some of the noise when we think about this discussion, a highly politicized discussion about collapse. One way, as I've hinted just now, is to think about collapse as an ideological signifier. It helps make sense and meaning of the world. In this sense, we might think that it fits into this broader repertoire of meaning making, whether we're thinking about the role of order in Russian legitimation, the role of a strong state, of repeating some of the mistakes that led to state collapse in 1991, that forms a part of a broader legitimation and ideological foundation of the regime. Of course, another way of looking at this might be that these messages are aimed at different audiences, maybe to produce different effects by politicizing, by synthesizing, also by influencing public opinion. And finally, this speaks to a broader debate about decolonization in the Russian context, which is not just limited to the question of collapse, part of a broader rethinking of the relationship between Moscow and the peoples of the Russian Federation. Mm-hmm. The second way we can think about collapse, I think, productively, is that it's, in many cases, a claim, it's an implicit claim about possible sources of regional mobilization in Russia. Right? These are claims that are often rooted in understandings of the role of nationalism and ethnic politics in Russia, as well as authoritarian centralization under Putin. And so it's these sets of claims that I want to focus on for the next 10 minutes or so of this talk. And underpinning these sets of claims are three interrelated issues. Right? The salience and potency of ethnic identity in Russia today, the relationship of different peoples and identity categories in the Russian Federation to the Russian state, and finally the drivers of regional elites' behavior. And it's these questions that form the principal question I seek to answer in the book, which is why nationalism has been a powerful mobilizing force among some ethnic groups in Russia, but not so much among other ethnic groups. Take, for example, Tatarstan. It witnessed some of the most widespread ethno-nationalist mobilization across the Soviet Union, greater than, in some cases, titular groups in the Union republics. And so you can see here, this is excluding titular groups in Union republics, but just looking at all other groups. Volga Tatars are characterized by quite a lot of protest activity. And Crimean Tatars are way off the chart here. But for every case of high mobilization like in Tatarstan, you can find similar cases if we're looking at economic development, if we're looking at the fact of ethnic distinctiveness, if we're looking at administrative structures that saw very little ethnic mobilization. Now, this is not a topic that has not been addressed before, so my work builds upon two bodies of literature. One of the most prominent explanations for nationalist mobilization is that the ethno-federal institutions that were created by the Bolsheviks both exacerbated or kind of reinforced, and in sometimes even created identity-based cleavages where they didn't previously exist. So in this case, the institutions are the primary causal movers in a chain of events. Institutions lead to nationalism, right? And a related body of literature built upon these insights, but instead focused on some of the non-structural ways in which, for example, ethnic entrepreneurs, elites, and framing could mobilize individuals. Now, less attention has been paid to possible pre-Soviet drivers of Soviet and post-Soviet ethno-nationalist mobilization. And so in this sense, we might think that the Bolsheviks at times responded to pre-existing nationalist mobilization, right? The Russian Empire was collapsing at this time. And so nationalism is both perhaps a cause of these institutions as well as being an effect of them. And so in this sense, I build upon a literature in political science on historical legacies, some of which has extended its insights to look at pre-Soviet legacies of social and ideational persistence. My key argument here is that pre-Soviet imperial rule had enduring effects on ethno-nationalist mobilization. Specifically, I argue that it meaningfully shaped the content, potency, and persistence of national narratives. It did so in a couple of ways, by influencing foundational moments, how people made sense of who we are, where we came from, as well as their relationship to the state, what Herr describes as national stories, right? The folklore of the national people, stories passed through generations about national successes and failures, and who stood with us or against us. Now, beyond the specific content of these stories, I also argue that it shaped the ascriptiveness and thickness of local identities. Right? In some cases, people try to draw clear distinctions between themselves and a constitutive other, which in the context of empire is often, but not always, Moscow ethnic Russians or ethnic Slavic migrants. National narratives, we know from existing literature, tend to be relatively enduring over time and self-perpetuating, not only through institutions such as education, but also through intergenerational communication and interaction. Now, if I'm making an argument about imperial rule, Russian imperial rule was anything but homogeneous. We're talking about over 5 centuries of rule across around 1/6 of the Earth's surface. So my argument here is that local narratives were shaped by historical political violence. In cases where there is greater levels of political violence towards communities, foundational stories tended to center fraught relations with Russia, lionizing pre-colonial and resistance leaders, and providing a usable history for ethnic entrepreneurs and politicians to galvanize mass support in the perestroika era. While little researchers examined pre-Soviet sources of political violence, we know from extensive political science research that Stalin-era political violence had enduring effects across generations. Large literature on ethnic conflict has found that prior conflict tends to be a strong predictor of future conflict. Of course, one of the challenges here is that very few data sets look prior to 1945. Very hard to find comparable data from multiple countries. This is especially the case in the Russian Empire. So in terms of nationalism, I try and capture nationalism in a few different ways. One is behavioral, so looking at the amount of ethno-nationalist protests. Another is attitudinal, looking at survey data from the early 1990s. I'll talk a bit about at the end about why this time period is helpful for us as analysts, looking at their political preferences. And my independent variable is pre-Soviet political violence from 1547 to 1900. Main hypothesis here is greater levels of political violence should predict greater levels of nationalism. And that these effects should, and this is a tougher test of the theory, but they should also hold when we try and control for Soviet-era variation, right? Mm-hmm. So for administrative status, for whether there were also Stalin-era repressions. I won't go into this today, but another aspect of this argument is that linguistic assimilation dampens these effects, right? Interpersonal communication is important for perpetuating these narratives, so if there's linguistic assimilation, then this stops these narratives from perpetuating. Now, I actually found some data to try and measure and operationalize political violence. There's very few data sets that look prior to 1945, and so to do so, I draw upon the first complete catalogue of Russian military operations, only published in 2019, that covers over 7,000 specific events compiled by Russian historians over 2 volumes. So they each look something like this, featuring links to archival data, descriptions of the battle, the geography, the warring parties. Some of these are really detailed if we get to the 19th century, but some, if we're looking at the 16th century, it's maybe just a line or 2. Now, a couple of words about the project. This is part of the Runiverse project, platform on Russian history, launched in 2009, and it has a distinctly pro-Kremlin agenda. Vladimir Medinsky, who we may remember as Russia's former culture minister, he's on the board of directors and was a prominent patron of this platform. In 2009, he even said that, look, there's not an institute that would deal with historical propaganda, and that's why we're losing the war aimed at falsifying Russian history. This was back in 2009. So the reason I mention these biases is that we've got to bear this in mind when using it as a data source. But in my case, I think it actually is helpful for the argument, because if there is bias, it's probably in the direction of underplaying and de-emphasizing the extent of political violence rather than the opposite. So I think it provides a tougher test of the theory here. And so I manually created a database by looking at, this was coding by ethnic group month from 1547 onwards, or from the first mention of that ethnic group. Coded 1 if the Russian state was engaged in some militarized conflict with that group in a given month, 0 otherwise. And I don't distinguish between the types of militarized conflict. The data is not rich enough for us to accurately do that, but it produces a fairly comprehensive list nonetheless. Okay, so if we look at the aggregate value over this period, the bottom axis we're looking at log of combat duration in months, and then this is scatterplotted with the number of ethno-nationalist protests in the late perestroika period, we see there's a general positive relationship, right? Greater pre-Soviet violence, greater Soviet-era protest activity. Now, one thing to point out is even if we take away Tatarstan and Chechnya, which are clear outliers here, the relationship still holds. Again, this though is just correlation, so I want to look into maybe the causal effects of this. So, around some OLS regressions, just with a couple of controls given the low number of observations, but essentially looking at whether a region was an ASSR in 1989 and whether the ethnic group in question, the titular ethnic group, was deported en masse under Stalin. In this case, greater conflict in a pre-Soviet Union, pre-Soviet period does predict greater nationalist mobilization, right? So this coefficient represents the predicted increase in protests for each month of pre-Soviet combat, militarized combat. So on average, every 8 months of increased combat predicts another protest. This is looking at individual micro-level attitudes, so looking at survey of several thousand non-ethnic Russian participants in 1993. This is from the Colton Huff survey data, and here I ran a series of logistic regression models that include standard demographic variables with standard errors clustered by ethnic groups. So they just allow us to gauge a few responses and dimensions of nationalism, because people were asked directly about their opinion on various topics. So I won't go into too much detail regarding these, but essentially, one being whether people identify more with their republic than with Russia. 2 is whether they think that the titular language, so Tatar and Tatarstan, should be the sole official language. 3 is whether people approve of their region's sovereignty declaration. And 4 is whether people think the titular language should be taught to everybody, every child in the region. Now, here we see a similar story. The effect is relatively minor in magnitude, but it's still detectable. Greater combat duration does predict greater nationalist attitudes across the board. Skip a couple of this because I want to get to a little bit to the qualitative aspect of this study. So thus far I've mostly been looking at broadly regional statistic tests. But this project started out very much as a qualitative project. I lived in Tatarstan for 3 years. This kind of sparked this interest in its sovereignty movement. This was in the 2010s when overt manifestations of nationalism were already a thing of the past. You could still palpably feel ways in which nationalist sentiment was still salient in many aspects of life. So I engage in a few pair comparisons. One is Tatarstan and Chuvashia, where there is high nationalist mobilization, and Chuvashia, where there is less nationalist mobilization. I look at archival documents from that contemporary period to see how people were thinking about nationalism, how they were thinking about their relationship to the Russian state. And here I have a couple of hypotheses. One is that antagonistic historical relations should feature prominently in Tatar discourse. This isn't a confirmation of the theory, but it's definitely a hook test that the theory needs to be able to pass to be viable. And the second hypothesis is that Chuvash discourse should also acknowledge that benign historical relations actually complicate activists' efforts to garner support. Okay, so here are just some broad brushstrokes, some illustrative examples, but this is from the Tatar Public Center, which is the main nationalist organization. They write a letter to Gorbachev in 1989, really framing their demands for increased autonomy in the language of historical statehood. And you might think, of course, this is understandable, right? We would expect nationalist organizations to talk about issues of autonomy in this language, right? But we also see that this language permeates down into the mass media, for example. Here you see several series and editorials talking about issues of cultural and historical significance. So here, for example, rethinking the Imperial period. A similar story is played in Tatar language publications. Here a little bit, the language tends to be a bit stronger in its condemnation of imperial rule. And even at the very individual level, when we're looking at letters that were written by ordinary people to these organizations, many of them highlight historical antagonism, and this informs demands for greater autonomy. Now, in contrast, Chuvashia has had more peaceful interactions with the Russian state since its incorporation in the mid-16th century. This has been acknowledged by other scholars who have looked at the case, and on the whole, Chuvash were assimilated to Russian Orthodoxy in the 18th century, although pagan traditions still endured until the present. Now, these historical relations shaped the more moderate aims of Chuvash nationalists. And the key for my argument here is that the nationalists themselves were very much aware of this. They're aware that history in some ways weakened their basis for mass mobilization. Here are just a few illustrative examples. Chuvash intellectuals would point to what historian Dmitriev described as a complex characterized by national nihilism. Right? While nationalist newspapers would also lament that they struggled to galvanize mass support for things such as language revival. And indeed, this was one report on the local presidential election in which the nationalist candidate narrowly lost. A researcher from the National Academy of Sciences noted with surprise that this candidate didn't focus on nationalist issues at all, concluding that it was probably because they lacked support on the ground. And so one of the stories that occurred in Chuvashia after this was intellectuals started to seek a basis for an alternative basis for mobilization, tapping into pre-imperial sources of religious distinctiveness and trying to lean on sources of Chuvash national religions and spirituality. Now, I don't have time to get into this, but essentially this struggle to galvanize support beyond a relatively small number of intellectuals. And also it struggled to avoid pushback from, in many cases, the Russian Orthodox Church, which saw the revival of pagan symbols even as something that was a security issue. So why does all of this matter? In Tatarstan, local political elites would come to co-opt this nationalist movement, and Tatarstan would pursue extensive autonomy in the years and decades afterwards. It would pursue bilateral power-sharing treaties with Moscow, maintaining this until 2017, creating state-like institutions, including foreign consulates, dual citizenship, and it also controlled a pretty ambitious education policy that included mandatory Tatar language classes until 2017. And moreover, and this is something I've written about in a Ponar's memo, it was the only region in Russia that maintained the title of president until as late as February 2023. And part of the story, I argue here, is a long arc of history, that in some regions, elites benefited and at times were actually influenced by attitudes at the mass level. So finally, some policy implications. So one thing I haven't talked so much about today is ethnic mobilization post-2022. And I think this is one of the real issues that we're all grappling with. I recommend Ponar's ebook that was published a couple of months ago on the regional dimension of the war, Russia's war against Ukraine. But ultimately, I think we are struggling with issues of data limitation and evidential gaps that make any definitive argument quite difficult. Let me just give one example, which is the big debate that's taking place at the moment about whether we can trust public opinion polling in Russia. I won't get into the debate, it's one that's taking place right now. But this is even more fraught if we imagine that even nationally representative surveys such as those conducted by Levada, you get maybe 2 or 3 dozen, say, Tatar respondents and very few respondents from other ethnic minority groups. So it's very hard even to get the data, which is itself contested by political science, by anthropologists and others on this topic. So if we don't have this data, I'd like to suggest that we could do worse than looking back at the last period when there was a real opening with some good high quality public opinion data, accessible archival documents, and also the dust has settled on some of these debates that allow us to understand what really took place. Now, as for conclusions, there's really 2 key ones that I think flow from this research. First is, I don't think it always makes a lot of sense to talk about ethnic politics in the singular when talking about Russia. There's a lot of variation, and I think that the fact of ethnicity and ethnic distinctiveness alone is not always sufficient if we're interested in thinking about attitudes towards autonomy or even in the extreme separatism. And finally, I think there's a longer arc of history that could be helpful when thinking about this question of collapse that I began the talk with. I think in the late 1980s and 1990s, constructivism was really trying to combat sort of primordial scholarship. And I think in this case it was perhaps commonplace to overstate the degree to which identities were easily shaped by political players. I think one corollary of this is maybe we might give too much credit to the Kremlin's own nation-building policies and the success that they supposedly have in 2025. And I think in this reading it's premature perhaps to write off the possibility of some broader mobilization under particular political conditions. Many of these narratives haven't totally faded from the scene, although expressing them of course is not possible right now. And the final aspect of this is that these national stories are also shared by elites. I think that there's a tendency to reduce elite behavior in Russia's regions to simply maintaining power, that these are kind of kleptocratic, self-interested actors. And I'm not saying that this isn't the case. I think it's perfectly possible to say that they're both this, but they also, they also care about issues of symbolic nature. And so an example of this is Tatarstan's presidency. So in 2015, Putin said, this was regarding Tatarstan's refusal to comply with a federal law, right? There should be one president in Russia. Tatarstan maintained its president. Putin said in 2015, call me a kettle, just don't put me in the oven. In a way, Putin was right. It didn't actually matter what the title was called. It wasn't a case of bilateral power sharing, so it didn't really make a difference to Tatarstan's actual power by having a president, or he's now called Rais, which basically means president in Arabic. But here's the rub. It did matter to Tatarstan's elites, clearly, the title. Not because their power, they're interested in power or they're kleptocratic, but in part because they belong to a community that saw the office of president as meaning something, both with regard to Tatar's relationship to the state, but also its own special relationship with Russia. And I think if we think about why Tatarstan's elites were engaging in so much heel-dragging, rational self-interest can't really tell us the entire story. So my main argument is really that history has a sticking power. It's not a mutually exclusive argument with many of the perspectives that I've cited, but this might be either a cause for optimism or pessimism depending on where you stand. And with that ambiguous ending, I'd like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you for a very stimulating talk. I think you put a lot of provocative ideas out on the table. So in the interest of the audience, let me open the floor for questions. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and identify yourself and fire away. Yes?
My name is Jason, and I'm a graduate student here at George Washington. So one of my, I have a question right now is, just based on your experience, how would you predict the future of Chechnya? Do you think, so to be more specific, like, so let's say the current war with Ukraine just ended. So how do you say the future of Chechnya would be? Is it going to be closer to Putin, or it is soon going to be on its own?
Yeah, why don't you actually probably I think it's more entertaining when you just answer the question, and then we'll move on to the next one.
Yeah, thanks, Jason.
Otherwise, then you can skip the tricky ones.
That's a great question. So I would just say that I'm not a specialist on Chechen politics.
Okay, that's okay.
But as I see the situation, well, I think that the relationship between Kadyrov and Putin is obviously a lot more personalized, I think, than with other regional leaders in Russia. I think there's also the issue that de facto Chechnya has been given a lot of sovereignty in exchange for its loyalty. So I think there's that patron-client relationship that, were Putin to disappear, I think that would be one of the big questions and one of the potential hotspots people point to. In terms of being closer to Putin, so I think it's also interesting that you're seeing Kadyrov at least emerging as somebody who is trying to carve out a bigger role for himself within kind of the war economy. But this doesn't mean that Kadyrov has solely been implementing Kremlin decrees. For example, with the partial mobilization, I mean, he famously said that Chechnya already fulfilled its quota, and so he's trying to position himself, I think, as a voice of certainly the Chechen people.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of what happens afterwards, I think a lot depends on the nature of transitional power. And it seems most likely that there would be some form of continuation of Putinism. I think there would probably be a way in which that relationship would be maintained. It's not just one way. It's also that there's also the Chechen elites who are integrated into Moscow institutions as well. So yeah.
So in your opinion, you would say the future of Chechnya would mainly depends on how Kadyrov, the relationship between Putin and Kadyrov. So let's say if their relationship becomes worse,
Mm-hmm.
so that means Chechnya may be its own, or the people will still choose to go back to Russia. So it just depends on how these two leaders' relationships, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
I think partially it's a question of the relationship management, but I think in general the relationship's been managed pretty well. I think, and again this is looking at Tatarstan, I think the Kremlin has been relatively good at times at trying to engage in damage limitation when it comes to issues of symbolic importance. But I think the big unknown is the nature of transition, and it's not
Okay.
if but when that transition occurs.
Gotcha.
Yeah, great question.
Thank you.
Just in the back.
Hi, my name is Nick Castillo. I'm a program officer at the Caspian Policy Center. I have two questions, which I hope is all right. The first being, obviously there's limitations on our data, like you were explaining, but just anecdotally or anything like that, do you have an understanding of how the bills passed by the Verkhovna Rada are being perceived within Chechen, Ingush, and Circassian circles, even just anecdotal data, if people understand it and know about it? And then secondly, if in your research you're incorporating or working with the theory that first generation literacy is a big predictor of levels of nationalism later on. So for example, that Western Ukrainian the first mass scale literacy education was in Ukrainian versus in Eastern Ukraine, where the first generation of mass scale literacy education was in Russian, and that predicted later levels of nationalism. So those two questions.
Yeah, great questions. On the first question, I don't have a lot of data on that. Mostly been looking at, again, kind of exile organizations, communities, that response. Don't know as for within these regions, within Russia themselves. As for the second one, yeah, that's definitely something I'm working with. So, at least one of the big, one of the major pieces that I sort of, build upon, and I really learn a lot from is Dardan Krzymala-Busse's pre-communist education, kind of inculcating and setting in stone processes that endure after generations. So I think I look at that in part. I think what does schooling represent? I think it represents one very powerful institution, especially when we think about literacy. It opens up so many worlds of getting information. My take on this is that it's not the only institution. Right? Schooling is important, but it's not it's not necessary, for example, to inculcate these types of national identities. And so I think that in the case of a lot of ethnic minorities in Russia, it's not only the case of schooling, because you can actually see that schooling doesn't necessarily have to take place with a specific ideology, and there'll still be some narratives that tend to endure over time, especially when we're thinking about the Soviet period, where a very specific understanding of history was taught throughout the schools. You still had these kind of more antagonistic or revisionist views sort of seeping through. So in a nutshell, yes, but also I think there's a little bit more to the story, but kind of hoping to tease out. But great questions, thank you.
Then, yes.
Yeah, hello, my name is Jonathan. I'm a visiting scholar here at the Institute. Thank you very much for your demonstration. It was very, very clear and very interesting. Keeping in mind your argument about the fact that history sticks, can you explain if and how ethnic minorities perceive Moscow elites or the Russian states between the Imperial period and then the Soviet one and then today? If there was a shift or no? And the second question, which is linked to that, is do you see or do you know if there is also a shift or continuity for the perception of Moscow elites regarding those ethnic minorities during these 3 periods?
So the first question on shifts and continuities, we're looking at post-imperial, pre-Soviet, and then into
yeah, like imperial period and Soviet period and now. If there is a shift or no, and
I think I think generally speaking there is some degree of continuity. I mean, I think prior to the two 1917 revolutions, you do start to see organisations emerging that are, whether this is in the original the first Dumas, where you're seeing kind of an all-Muslim faction emerge. They're starting to think about questions of autonomy, not separatism, but certainly about autonomy and revision of the relationship. And I think at that point you're also seeing some patterns emerge that I think I see later on in the period, which is to say that for example in Chuvashia there's certainly they're not integrating and sort of interacting as much with some of the Muslim representatives, but also their demands tend to be more moderate at this time. So this is part of the story of kind of the educational reforms in the late 19th century that Chuvash educators seeing orthodoxy and preservation of culture as actually being highly compatible in ways that even outsiders looking in would not see as compatible. So one anecdote I suppose is that Taras Shevchenko is kind of traveling through the Volga region, passing Cheboksary, and he kind of makes this distinction that these Orthodox cathedrals, who they built for, not the Chuvash, but they're built for orthodoxy. And but interestingly, for example, Ivan Yakovlev, who was one of the main Enlightenment figures, a teacher, he's actually knew Lenin's father, and there's a whole backstory about how how that ended up influencing Soviet nationalities policy. But Yakovlev, for example, didn't see that as being a binary. He thought that both of those were totally compatible with Chuvash culture. And so I think we do see those broader continuities over time, at least in the cases that I've been looking at.
Hi, my name is Miguel Rosar, PhD student at Political Science. Thank you for this great presentation. I have a very quick question regarding your quantitative analysis. I was wondering, can you tell me more about the mechanisms specifying the duration of the conflict? Like, because you talk about your IVs, like political violence, but I'm not sure, like, the number of that or intensity of the conflict. What's the mechanism specifying the duration of 8 months, if I remember?
Yeah, great question. So the data doesn't allow us to, for example, information about casualties only appeared, for example, in records in the 19th century and beyond. So rather than trying to capture the intensity, looking at, say, casualties, for example, I'm just looking at the time period. And that's an imperfect measure, but I'm looking at the duration, just measured in months, as being a proxy for intensity. So I'm not sure if that helps answer the question. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, just question, follow-up question with that. But do you control for the prehistorical period of those 19th century data? So like when the territory was under control of Russian Empire and Russian state?
Yeah, I think in one of the tests, I need to double check, but in one of the tests, I think I include a control for that. Certainly, what I do is I only include observations from the first mention of that group. So it actually is not looking at. I mean, the assumption is that if there wasn't any mention, say prior to the 19th century, that's because there wasn't any conflict prior to the 19th century. Possibly, it doesn't mean that there wasn't any bilateral interaction, but in terms of the number of years, I mean, I control for the lagged conflict, but also the number of years that since the first mention in the data. So certainly, as a general rule, there's less and less. As a group has been part of the Russian Empire, there's less and less likelihood of political violence over time.
Sure.
Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Tanya Tramova. I'm an assistant professor of Russian here at GW. I have a follow-up question about religion. You mentioned that a lot of the political violence historically was connected to religion. And I'm wondering whether religion is a factor in the contemporary context for you, and especially how that relates to religious diversity in the areas that you look at. For instance, in Tatarstan, there are groups, religious minorities like Christianity, for instance, Christian Tatars, and there has been historically some conflict around the issues of religion for the understanding of national identity, specifically in Tatarstan.
This is a really great question. In terms of contemporary, so I do think that certainly as a boundary-making device, I think that religion does have that capability. I think looking at the case of Chuvashia, for example, where you have that syncretic, there's Russian Orthodoxy, but then there's also pre-existing pagan traditions. I think that does make it harder to distinguish oneself, I think, from at least ethnic Russians. Whereas, in the case of Islam, I think that's a very, that's a readily available kind of a boundary marker. But it doesn't mean that it necessarily is in opposition to being Russian. And I think that's one of the ways we're seeing kind of Russian identity and nation building being developed now, is that there's an emphasis on this, multi-confessional, multi-ethnic nation where, if you're looking at Russian identity as a civilizational identity, then it's maybe more accepting of the role of Islam, the role of paganism, the role of other religious minorities. So I'm not sure if that answers your question or not, but that's kind of one way in which I see it. But also,
the kind of debates that I was kind of trying to reference were the kind of conversations within the Tatar community about what makes one Tatar and whether religious component is an important one. And I know that, for instance, for minority groups such as Christianity, the belonging was kind of complicated by not necessarily adhering fully to the religious identity that is considered to be, titular for Tatarstan.
Yeah, I think definitely the period I'm looking at is one in which there's a lot of kind of rediscovery and interpretation of the role of religion. So I think that at that time there's still very much kind of a Soviet generation of activists who maybe are thinking about religion in some instrumental sense or as a symbolic sense, but not so much really engaging with the content of religion. And I think nowadays that's changed a lot. So there's religion is important, but it's important in very different ways. And so you have from kind of more pan-Islamist ways of thinking of the identity to kind of more secular, kind of nationalist ways of viewing the role of religion and identity. So I think that's definitely something that's, you can see that in Tatar identity now. I think at this time there were still divisions, but it was very much emerging from a particular set of, this was the late Soviet period where much of the emphasis was on kind of rebuilding and sort of re-identifying rather than 20 years later you're seeing really a kind of a flourishing of different schools, I suppose.
Why would you say that the fact that Chechnya and Tatarstan are outliers on your graph that you showed earlier is still a prerequisite to a very specific religious tradition?
I think that the...
or do you think political violence is more important?
My sense is political violence is sometimes related to religion and sometimes not. So, for example, even just with the Tatars, for example, there was intense periods of missionary activity, but then you have Catherine II, and there's a great kind of toleration, kind of a flourishing of urban Tatar culture, and so there's a lot of variation even with relation to religion at given points in time. And I think at that point, my conclusion at least is political violence is important in that initial story making and narrative formation period.
Thank you.
I'm Mr. Kwang, a PhD student from History Department at GW. So I have also questions from the religion. So my understanding is that from the late 19th century, Tatar elites played a huge important role in reforming, institutionalized the religion of Islam, not just in their region but across the Central Asia. So my first question is, do you think this this is related to what you discussed today, that how they preserve their identity, even in contemporary society. And my second question is also related that Tatar elites are also people who invented pan-Turkism, right? So I'm thinking about, is this a sense of like, though we are minorities in Russia Federation, but we have Turkey brothers and sisters across over the world, is this kind of science of mindset influence their identity, preserving their identity? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think for the first question, I think many urban Tatars' role as intermediaries in the context of empire was really important, both for, again, this is a period in which the Tsarist Empire is starting to expand more fully into Central Asia. Again, Tatar clerics and merchants are really acting as these intermediaries. But also it's a time in which they're cooperating with imperial power while also carving out, I think, their own spaces of autonomy for thinking about their own kind of urban intellectual life. And I think that's an interesting dynamic that you see across empires, but this role of intermediary status. And I think, like with the pan-Turkism, I think it's definitely part of identity. Just as I think whenever we look above the level of the nation, there are whole sorts of possible supranational identities we might look at. And so I think pan-Turkism definitely one of them. I think there's a lot of institutional attempts by Turkey, for example, to promote that, but I'm not sure how fully salient that is at the everyday level. But I think it's definitely part of it's influential to a certain extent.
I asked this first question because your research focuses on the violence, and for me, violence seems to be like a side that you can say oppression, resistance, which are very important. But in Tatar case, I think there are also cooperation, as you just mentioned. That actually, they in the Russian Empire, they work closely with the emperor power, right? The Tatar elite. So I think this is another interesting dynamic that we can explore.
That's really helpful, I think, actually, because I think there's definitely some cases in which there's a stronger blend of cooperation and prior conflict. I think it's something to look more into, but that's really helpful to think about. Thank you.
I have a question. Hey, I'm Zarina Saltseva, a visiting scholar here at GW, and I'm from Ingushetia actually. But my question is mostly about like Putin is trying, to implement this like identification of peoples of Russia as Ruskiye. So in all his interviews now, he indicates we Ruskiye, and then even in these new history books, they have like a definition like we like Ruskiye, and in brackets like Rusichi, I don't know, like Chechens, Chuvash, etc. Like, but do you think that they could succeed in promoting this world and accepting this world by peoples of Russia? I mean, nullifying the ethnic identity that peoples of Russia have.
It's a really great question. So I find it really hard to know. I mean, I think there's some evidence that there's a certain degree of societal buy-in to some broader identity, whether it's unification around conservative values, whether it's tapping into Westernism, whether that's constitutive of identity in a broader ethnic sense. I don't know. I mean, I think there are objective processes like ethnic re-identification, right, and inter-ethnic marriages that do generally tend to the children tend to identify as Russian, but not always. But I'm not sure. I mean, I think that.
Because for us, still, if someone calls us Ruskiye, we consider it as some kind of insult. So inside of Russia, at least.
Yeah, and I think at least from my finding is that again, it can be quite challenging at the moment with public opinion data, and also to get a sense of how these processes play out in real time. It's easier, with respect to hindsight, to look at processes 50, 100 years ago and see how identity changes. But at least my conclusion is that maybe these we see a lot of discourse and institutional attempts at the top-down level, but I'm skeptical as to whether, like you said, they actually really resonate from the bottom up. But thank you.
Yes, please.
So I did have one last question. It might be a little overly tangential to your research focus, but I'm just kind of curious. There are such large numbers of Russian citizens of Ukrainian or Belarusian heritage relatively recently, quite often as well.
Mm-hmm.
Do you ever come across any kind of attempt to mobilize that identity in the Russian context, that there are people who are ethnic Ukrainians in Russia who try to re-Ukrainianize or re-Belarusianize, or because they're East Slavs, do they also, is that just sort of seen as an impossibility?
It's a really good question. I don't have a very good answer to that question. All I know is that from some previous research, and published a piece in Russia Post on the census, for example, is you see again you do see a huge decline actually in numbers of ethnic Belarusians and Ukrainians, presumably because people are re-identifying in the census as Russians, and there's a whole host of reasons for that. But if you look at the numbers here, actually these communities are really shrinking. Not to mention, I think, especially anecdotally, I mean, I think a lot of Ukrainian organizations in Moscow have been pressured to close, and I think there are a lot of pressures to assimilate into the Russian community. But I don't know about the actual answer, the question you posed, but it's an interesting one.
So in the survey data, when you see a decrease in identification, would you say that the war and the ideology that the war sort of is attached to is the primary driver, or simply time, or governmental pressure?
Well, I think this was before the war, before the full-scale war. And again, people criticise the census because of taking place under, this was post-pandemic. But nonetheless, I think it was you saw a precipitous drop in your Ukrainian and Belarusian communities. If you're looking at the ethnic communities that have shrunk the most, those are really up there. I'm not sure of the precise figures, but of course that also means that the relative number of ethnic Russians in the Russian Federation is probably slightly inflated because you have people who are, for one reason or the other, re-identifying.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Let's see, I have a question. It was sort of a methodology question, but I was wondering, why did you end up picking the Tatars and the Chuvash as your case studies? Because looking at Russia, you have so many ethnic groups, and a logical comparison might be Tatars versus Chechens, because they're both looking to be mobilized, but do it in a different way. So how did you come up with that? And then did you look at the whole, you have n equals 2 in a case study approach, but you could have n equals hundreds.
Yeah, that's a great question. So Tatarstan, I think, a core case study, primarily because that's where the project emerged from that, that lived experience and sort of focusing on that region. Chuvashia in part because, it's a neighboring Turkic republic, similarly majority, titular population, but lower mobilization. But certainly in the book project, and this came from the doctoral dissertation, I do look at other groups. So I do look at Bashkortostan, Kalmykia, for example. But certainly those are the kind of two core groups. But I think if I have a bit more time, then I'd love to focus on groups in the Caucasus, for example. But it's usually a case of time constraints and money constraints. But it's those two are the key things.
Right.
But,
and then when you're answering the question about Chechnya, you turn to this personal factor, which wasn't part of your theory.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, why did you do that?
Yeah.
Because I'm sure in Chechnya you have a long history of conflict with Russia, which would, according to your theory, predict strong ethnic mobilization, right? Just like you have in Tatarstan. So, do you think? So I don't know. I just wonder, why don't you stick to your theory, which is a good theory, and instead bring in this other variable of the personal relations, which, and then I start to wonder, well, how strong are these personal relations?
Yeah. No, that's really well noted. So I think that. So one thing to say is that I don't think that it's mutually exclusive with other approaches. And I think the Chechen example is a very good case of highly patronalistic, right, patron-client relationship. But I think probably where I would say the theory comes in is maybe in qualifying the extent to which this is maybe genuinely this is sort of genuine, or it's in sync with public opinion. And I think one thing about the regional elites is that they've been very good at developing relations with Moscow that have been mutually beneficial, of course, for them and their own power. But ultimately, I think there's still that latent understanding. Again, I can't get into these people's minds, but I think there's still that latent understanding that's shared at the bottom, at the mass level as well. Yeah. I think yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, I think we've come to the end of the hour. So please join me in thanking Adam for an excellent presentation.